Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm very happy to be here today with a longtime author of Orbis Books, including her most recent book, More Hidden Women of the Gospels. And as the title suggests, this book by Kathy Coffey is a sequel to a book that we published many years ago called Hidden Women of the Gospels. And maybe this could be a series, 10 years we'll do even more hidden women of the Gospels or something like that. The first book was very successful, so I'm really delighted that Kathy, who's an author of many very popular books, has taught and spoken, given retreats around the country, took up the challenge again. And in the first book, she highlighted women who sometimes their names appear in the gospel stories and sometimes they're anonymous or in the background somehow. And she brings them to the foreground and kind of lets them speak imaginatively in their own voice about their encounters with Jesus. So she's done the same thing in this book, but even gotten a little bit more creative, talking about women, for instance, who appear in the parables, and imagining women that are not even referred to in the text. So, Kathy, welcome. And why don't you tell me first, what was your conception, or what do you mean by hidden women of the Gospels?
Well, thank you. I guess for all of Jesus's lifetime on earth, we couldn't have eliminated half the human race. And so those women's stories, I thought, were just aching to be told, that they got edited out or were never recorded. And so consequently, I use a Midrash technique, which is imagining in the blank spaces between the lines. And for example, at the Last Supper, we know that the men didn't cook or clean in those days, although they would now. But so who cleaned it? Who cooked it up? There had to be women lurking in the background there. And what were their stories? So I was intrigued enough to imagine some of those stories, or to take the stories we have and look at them from a different angle. For example, in the parables, the foolish bridesmaids get a bum rap, that we've always made fun of them. But if we look at that story more sympathetically, maybe it was a young girl who'd never been a bridesmaid. She didn't know the bridesmaid business. And what did her experience lead her to understand about God? And how did any of their experiences lead them closer to God? Given that they were operating as we are in a patriarchal culture where they were demeaned and derided and less valued. And we have abundant evidence of that from Hebrew texts. The prayer of the good Jewish boy was, "Thank God I wasn't born a woman." And so Jesus comes into that scene and disrupts it completely. He never derides women. He never makes them less. And women are his friends, his colleagues, his companions in the adventure. And we know how he relied on some of them, and I think we can imagine how others intersected his story.
I think that's an interesting point, that you're not just looking at the stories of these women, but through the voices or the story or the perspective of the women, you're also providing a different perspective on the gospel stories. And just as much as it highlights the experience of women with Jesus, it also kind of highlights the significance of Jesus's relationships with women that are not often held up in the foreground of the Gospels.
Yes. Well, Jesus's image bank is distinctly feminine. For example, when he talks about kneading the leaven into the dough, or when he washed his feet, all of that came from women's world. And they must have sat up and taken notice, because somebody finally understood their experience and then lifted their experience into the reign of God. So, for the instance, the woman who lost the coin and she sweeps the house and searches for that coin. Well, where did he get that story? And I wonder about the boy Jesus, maybe seeing that happen and storing it in his imagination to pull out later.
There are, obviously well-known women whose names are preserved in the gospel stories, Mary Magdalene and his friends, Mary and Martha of Bethany. But there's so many women often whose stories, who stand as kind of paradigmatic disciples, examples of faith, whose names are not remembered. And we know them as the Samaritan woman, or the Syrophoenician woman, or the woman who washed his feet with her tears, or anointed him. Even in the gospel story where Jesus says, "What she has been done will be told in memory of her," and yet her name is not remembered. We know the names of the men who complained about her, but not her name.
Well, they're
Yeah.
named for their towns,
Uh-huh.
like calling us the New York woman or the San Francisco woman.
Yeah, right.
Or they're named for the men that they're associated with, the mother of James and John, or the husband of somebody. So I created Mrs. Bartimaeus and the daughter of Zacchaeus, because we know they were there. They had to have been there. And what was their take on the events of the gospel?
You made a reference to Midrash. Could you say a little bit more about what that means, that tradition?
Well, it's approaching the Bible not through analysis, but through imagination. And it's an ancient technique used by the rabbis long before the time of Jesus, because the Jewish people loved their Bibles and they wanted to know what were the untold stories there, what were the what's the unfinished business, and so they imagined it. And I think it's just as helpful for us to create some balance when we've had an overly male approach. And people who have listened to homilies for years, all from a male clerical point of view, I'm itching to get the woman's point of view in there.
The could you give a couple of examples, or go a little bit deeper into one of these stories, one or another, that you think is typical of the book and also of what you're trying to do?
Well, I pictured Zacchaeus teaching his daughter how to climb trees too. And so she shimmied up with him that day that they looked down into a grin. And then he takes Jesus home for a meal. He welcomes Jesus into his house. Well, who cooked it? And I pictured her running next door to get some extra bread from the neighbors and helping out with the meal, and just enjoying her dad's camaraderie with this Jesus who could joke with him and didn't seem to mind that he was an outcast and detested by the people of his town. And that this was a dad who gave her a pretty heightened sense of herself. But then to contrast that, the daughter of Herodias is the young woman who danced at Herod's banquet, and her mother pushes her to, when she's asked what she wants, and Herod says, "I'll give you half my kingdom." Her mother says, "Ask for John, the head of John the Baptist," and then it's presented to her, to this young woman, on a platter. And for a young girl, that must have been terribly traumatic. And what was her story? Maybe she just loved to dance and she's drawn into something way beyond her that she's just not ready for. And we can look from her story to those of many women traumatized today. I mean, the Me Too movement is showing those stories, and how did she ever reconcile that? And we don't know. A lot of these stories are unfinished. And so one of the things I do is include questions for reflection or discussion
Mm-hmm.
so that groups can use the book and talk about it at the end. And how do you think her story ended? We don't know. How
Mm-hmm.
would we end her story? Does she just vanish, or does
Mm-hmm.
she think about that, or is she terribly wounded?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the answer, but it's interesting to speculate.
What do you say there about the questions for reflection, and obviously that this is very well geared for study groups, which I would imagine particularly of interest to women, because the way you tell the stories is also not just helping us get back into the experience of the perspective of women in the Gospels, the hidden women of the Gospels, but applying the encounter with Jesus and the Gospel message or stories to our own lives, and trying to find points of connection or invitation to enter into that process of reflection.
What I say is it's not only do they get it, but do we?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people missed it in Jesus's time. A lot of people got it.
Mm-hmm.
And where are we going to fall on that spectrum? And how does it intersect with our own experience?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, women who were told repeatedly by the rabbis that they were inferior and sinful. And have we internalized any of that? All
Mm-hmm.
the old tropes about Eve and the persistent woman who bothers the judge, and she's portrayed there as evil, but could there be another side of that story? And where have we been perhaps obnoxious and persistent for justice?
Mm-hmm.
And where have we stood up to the prevailing norms and said, no, that's not okay? Just as Jesus said, enough. God didn't create two species here.
Mm-hmm.
God didn't envision a second class. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as he tried to set that right, and nearly many years later, centuries later, we haven't quite succeeded. How do we work to make real God's dream for all humanity?
Mm-hmm.
And when you mention women's groups, I think it's also I've had many men who have been grateful that it got them in touch with their own female side and
Mm-hmm.
their wives and daughters and sisters and
Mm-hmm.
mothers, and colleagues. We all work together. How can we better do that?
Even in the Gospels, there are these. Sometimes there'll be a reference to a woman, and it just uh, begs us to ask, what's the story behind that? I think of like is it Joanna who's
Went to the tomb.
who's the wife, though we say, she was the wife of the
The
steward
steward.
of Herod.
Yes.
So here's one of his closest disciples is married to the guy who works for the man who just killed John the Baptist, and you think, like, what's that all about?
Right.
And like,
Yeah.
what's the story behind that?
Yeah.
But or Mary Magdalene, who was had what is it, seven demons, or what is it? What is the reference to her? I don't know. We never know what that background of that story is, and of course, she traditionally was cast in this role of a repentant prostitute, which has no basis in the story. But so it's not as if the church has not kind of done its own imagination of who these women were.
Right.
And you're kind of opening up and inviting us, to take another look. I loved in the introduction when you said something like, you referred to your grandchildren and little ones who don't really get the idea of hide and seek, and call out from the closet, find me, find me. And the idea that there are these women in the story who who were calling out, "Find me," who wanted to have their story told, and as you say, maybe even God also calling out to us through these, women's stories to see the feminine dimension of God's own, self-revelation.
Right. Julian of Norwich in the 14th century spoke about the motherhood of God, and it hasn't been a concept that's really caught on, but I think it does offset some of the negative angles that we have on women now, and still they persist, even though we think we're the enlightened 21st century.
Do you think you have gotten to the bottom of the barrel, or are there more women calling out for you to find them?
I don't know. Well, I've run out of grandchildren now to dedicate books to. We'll see.
Your grandchildren's children someday, maybe, but it's a really fun and imaginative book, and one that you could just sort of take one story at a time, and then you want to go back to the Gospels themselves and be reminded of what those stories were. Any others that you like to share with us?
Well, I do like the element of play, because I think we often approach sacred texts with such solemnity and rigidity, like we could never play with them. And yet, that quote from Proverbs about an eye playing before him, I was God's delight. And how God plays with creation. And so I kind of played with the story of Bartimaeus, and how maybe his wife resented his cure because he had a pretty good income begging, and now it's just shot out the window. And maybe he's getting really annoying, pointing out everything he can see now. Or the sister of the deaf man whom Jesus cured. And of course, it's wonderful, but now he's constantly babbling at her, because now he can speak.
Yeah.
So,
we think of the stories as, people were cured and they lived happily ever after, and we don't, Jesus passed through their lives, sometimes indirectly, sometimes directly, and turned things upside down a little bit, and that was maybe caused some complications for people that they but a lot of them they think back on that guy or that man who came into their village or passed by their home, and that they're still kind of haunted by the impact that he left behind.
well, he upset the apple cart right and left, and broke every taboo in the book. So you're right. How would that affect them years later? And then for a couple of the women, I imagine them meeting Jesus years later. And so one of the stories is about his raising the young girl who he said was asleep, but the mourners were already assembled. And we know that there were professional women mourners at that time. And so they would have been crying and shrieking. And so the mourner lost her job, and she resented him. And yet later she encounters him on the road to Calvary, because that's not in scripture, but it's one of the stations of the cross where Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. And one scholar says that those quite possibly could have been professional mourners. And so does that then change her attitude, where she sees him suffering as she did, and sees him walking the pain, and he's not absent from that. He's in the midst of it, just as she has been.
They encountered him in his own vulnerability, and not just as the healer,
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. I heartily encourage people to read more hidden women from the Gospels, and if you find this interesting, there happens to be plenty more where that came from. in Hidden Women of the Gospels. And who knows if there won't be a third volume one day if we all live long enough. I would look forward to that. So thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank
Pleasure
you.
talking with you.